The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the air thick with quiet judgment. Maya Carter, a 17-year-old black teenager, stood at the defendant's table, her shoulders squared, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Judge Robert Calloway adjusted his glasses, his smirk barely concealed. He leaned forward, his voice laced with condescension. "Miss Carter," he drawled, stretching her name as if it amused him. "Do you even understand what you're being accused of?" A ripple of soft chuckles spread through the room. The audience, full of suited professionals and hardened skeptics, had already made up their minds. Just another kid caught in the system. Just another open and shut case. But Maya didn't flinch. She met the judge's gaze, unshaken. There was something in her eyes, calm, knowing. What no one realized was that this was no ordinary trial, and Maya Carter was about to turn the entire courtroom upside down.
Before we dive into today's story, we'd love your support. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more inspiring stories just for you. Now, without further ado, let's get started.
Judge Robert Calloway leaned back in his oversized chair, his thick robe draped over his bulky frame as if it had been carelessly thrown on. His fingers drummed lazily against the wooden bench, his expression one of thinly veiled amusement. He adjusted his glasses, peering down at the young girl standing before him. Maya Carter, a 17-year-old black teenager, stood with an unsettling calm, her hands resting neatly in front of her. The courtroom was packed with spectators, some whispering, others watching with detached curiosity, as if this were some kind of spectacle. Judge Calloway smirked, drawing out her last name with deliberate slowness. "Miss Carter," he said, the words practically dripping with condescension. "Do you even understand the gravity of the charges against you?" A few soft chuckles rippled through the gallery, and Calloway's smirk deepened. From the prosecution's table, David Langford, the district attorney, allowed himself a small, knowing smile. This was an easy case. At least, that's what he believed. A minor, caught in the act, standing in a courtroom where the odds were already stacked against her. Langford barely paid her any mind. She was just another defendant who didn't belong here. But Maya didn't react the way they expected. She didn't shrink under the weight of the judge's words. She didn't fidget or break eye contact. She simply stood there, still, composed, her face unreadable. The lack of fear, or perhaps the lack of submission, irritated Calloway. He leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of a man who expected instant compliance. "You seem awfully calm for someone who's about to have their future decided," he said. "You do realize that this isn't some after-school debate club, right? This is a courtroom. This is real life." Another round of laughter filled the room. A few of the suited men sitting in the gallery exchanged knowing glances, shaking their heads. Maya's gaze flickered briefly around the room, taking them all in. The smug expressions, the certainty in their eyes that this would be over quickly, that she would crumble the moment she spoke. They didn't know her. They didn't know what she was capable of. Her lips parted slightly, as if she might say something, but then she simply closed them again. A faint smile ghosted across her face. Not arrogant, not defiant, just knowing. The judge mistook her silence for hesitation, and his smirk widened. "That's what I thought," he muttered. Langford took this as his cue. The district attorney rose from his seat, straightening his expensive suit with a practiced motion. His entire demeanor exuded confidence, the confidence of a man who had done this 100 times before and never lost. "Your Honor," Langford began, his voice smooth and commanding, "this case is as clear-cut as they come." He turned slightly, facing the courtroom as if performing for an audience. The defendant was found at the scene of the crime. The evidence places her directly in connection with the illegal activity in question. And frankly, there is no reasonable doubt as to her guilt. Langford turned to Maya then, regarding her like an afterthought. This is just another case of a reckless teenager making a bad decision, he continued, his tone measured, almost bored. And now, instead of taking responsibility, she's trying to talk her way out of it. A few nods of agreement passed through the audience. Some whispered among themselves, as if this was already decided. Maya, however, remained motionless. She listened, not just to his words, but to his tone, to the confidence in his voice, the assumptions he was making, the way he dismissed her so easily like she was nothing more than a scared child trying to bluff her way through a losing fight. Langford was arrogant, too arrogant. He thought she was just another naive teenager trying to act smart. He had no idea what was coming next. Maya took a slow breath, steadying herself. Then, just as Langford continued speaking, she opened her mouth and said a single word. Objection. The entire courtroom went silent. Langford froze mid-sentence. His head snapped toward her, baffled. The judge raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering just slightly. The gallery, once filled with soft laughter, was now deathly still. Maya Carter had just flipped the entire energy of the room. And this trial was no longer what they thought it was. Objection. The single word sliced through the courtroom like a blade, halting David Langford mid-sentence. A murmur rippled through the audience. Heads turned. The judge's eyes flicked up, his smirk deepening into something between amusement and disbelief. Judge Robert Calloway leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "I'm sorry, did you just object?" His tone dripped with sarcasm, the corners of his mouth twitching as if he were holding back laughter. Maya didn't blink. "Yes, Your Honor," Langford scoffed, shaking his head as if he had just heard something ridiculous. A few chuckles floated from the gallery, but Maya stood firm. Judge Calloway let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Miss Carter, do you even know what objection means?" Maya tilted her head slightly, eyes steady. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was measured, unshaken. "The prosecutor is making assumptions about my intent, without providing context. That's speculative and inadmissible under Rule 403 of the Federal Rules of Evidence." The chuckles died instantly. A heavy silence settled over the room. Even Langford's smirk faded as he turned to Maya, his eyes narrowing. Calloway's fingers, which had been lazily tapping on his bench, stopped. He shifted in his chair, studying the girl in front of him. "Excuse me?" Maya clasped her hands behind her back. "Your Honor, the prosecution just stated that I am clearly guilty based solely on circumstantial factors. However, no direct evidence has been presented yet. That is an attempt to sway the court's perception prematurely." She exhaled smoothly. "Which, by definition, is prejudicial and not permissible as substantive proof." More whispers erupted from the gallery. Even the court clerk's hands hesitated over the keyboard. Langford's face hardened. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous," he snapped. "She's not a lawyer. She doesn't get to lecture us on courtroom procedure." Maya turned her head slightly, eyes sharp. "Then maybe you should follow courtroom procedure, Mr. Langford." The audience audibly gasped. Calloway's amusement vanished. He slammed his gavel so hard that the sound echoed through the chamber. "Enough," he snapped, his face now tight with irritation. "Miss Carter, I don't have time for games." Maya didn't flinch. Langford straightened his tie, trying to shake off the growing unease creeping up his spine. "Your Honor, this is a waste of time. The defense is trying to derail this trial with theatrics." Maya inhaled slowly before speaking. "No, Mr. Langford. I'm trying to expose the holes in your case." The judge pinched the bridge of his nose. "Miss Carter, you are here to defend yourself, not play lawyer." Maya clasped her hands in front of her. With all due respect, Your Honor, I am doing exactly that. And if this trial is fair, then my right to a fair defense should be upheld. The air in the courtroom shifted. Langford's once confident demeanor wavered. He knew something wasn't right. This girl wasn't scrambling to defend herself like most defendants. She wasn't scared. She was prepared. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. Let's just move on. Langford nodded, regaining his smug composure. As I was saying, Your Honor, the defendant— Permission to approach the bench, Your Honor, Maya interrupted. The room froze. Calloway's brow shot up. Excuse me? Maya stepped forward, her sneakers softly squeaking against the polished floor. I am requesting permission to present evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's claims. Langford let out a loud, exasperated sigh. Your Honor, she does not get to make demands. Maya turned toward him, her voice level. I'm not making a demand, Mr. Langford. I'm exercising my rights. Another round of whispers broke out in the audience. Calloway's jaw clenched as he studied her, trying to figure her out. You think you're clever, don't you? He muttered. Maya didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the folder sitting in front of her and pulled out a neatly stacked set of papers. She held them firmly in her grasp. This, she said, stepping forward, is a preliminary review of the prosecution's evidence, and it contains multiple inconsistencies that I would like to present to the court. The judge narrowed his eyes. What kind of inconsistencies? Maya took another step forward. For starters, she placed the stack of papers onto the judge's desk. The prosecution's primary piece of evidence, Exhibit B, the surveillance footage, is missing a timestamp and has an unverified chain of custody. Calloway's frown deepened. Is that true? Langford's face tightened. Your Honor, this is absurd. That footage clearly places her— But does it? Maya countered, her voice sharp but calm. Or does it just show someone who looks like me near the scene? She tilted her head. Because if that's the case, then this evidence is circumstantial at best and inadmissible at worst. Calloway looked down at the papers, flipping through them quickly. His expression darkened with each page. Langford's confidence was cracking. This raises concerns, Calloway muttered. Langford bristled. Your Honor, she's just— She's right, Calloway interrupted, his voice low. This evidence that isn't as solid as you made it sound. The prosecutor's jaw clenched. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Maya stood still, her heartbeat steady. She had just turned the case upside down, and everyone in that courtroom could feel it. Maya stepped back from the judge's bench, her presence commanding the attention of the entire courtroom. She placed her hands on the defense table, her voice unwavering. Let's go over Exhibit B again. She turned slightly toward David Langford, the prosecutor. You claim this surveillance footage is the strongest piece of evidence tying me to the crime. Langford straightened his tie, regaining his composure. That's because it does, he said firmly. It clearly shows you at the scene. Maya raised an eyebrow. Does it? Langford blinked. Excuse me? Maya reached for a document in her folder and held it up for the court to see. What's missing from this video, Mr. Langford? Langford huffed impatiently. I don't see your point. Maya exhaled slowly, then turned to the judge. Your Honor, this footage has no timestamp. A murmur rippled through the room. Judge Calloway's head snapped up. Is that true? Maya nodded. Not only that, but the footage was retrieved from an unverified source, meaning we have no confirmation of when it was taken, nor if it was altered. She let the words settle before continuing. And according to Federal Evidence Rule 901, evidence must be authenticated before it can be admitted in court. Judge Calloway looked at Langford, his frown deepening. Mr. Langford, is this true? Langford opened his mouth, then hesitated. He quickly flipped through his notes, searching for something, anything that could save him. I believe the timestamp is simply not visible in the version presented, he stammered. Maya didn't even blink. So you admit the timestamp is missing? Langford clenched his jaw. That doesn't mean the footage is unreliable. Maya crossed her arms. It means we can't confirm when or where it was recorded, which, in legal terms, makes it inadmissible. More whispers filled the courtroom. The once smug prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Judge Calloway's fingers drummed against the bench, his expression unreadable. Continue, Miss Carter. Maya nodded and reached for another document. Let's talk about Exhibit D, the so-called confession. Langford exhaled sharply. Oh, come on. Maya held up a hand, silencing him. This is a signed statement from me, correct? Langford crossed his arms. Correct. Maya turned to the judge. Your Honor, when was this statement taken? The judge flipped through his papers. According to the record, it was obtained at 3:47 a.m. Maya let that sit for a moment. 3:47 a.m., she repeated, shaking her head. Interesting, because at that hour I was sitting in an interrogation room alone, without legal representation. Judge Calloway stiffened. The prosecutor's confidence cracked just a little more. She never asked for a lawyer. Maya's eyes flashed. I didn't have to. She stepped forward. Minors have an automatic right to legal representation. That's federal law. You cannot interrogate a minor and obtain a confession without a lawyer present. Langford's jaw clenched. Maya turned toward the gallery, addressing the room. In other words, this confession is not legally valid. She turned back to the judge. And because of that, Exhibit D must be thrown out. Judge Calloway's grip on his gavel tightened. His frown was deepening with every passing second. Langford, for the first time, had no response. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Calloway exhaled through his nose, flipping through the evidence file again. The deeper he read, the more his face darkened. The evidence was falling apart. The case that had once seemed open and shut was now riddled with holes, thanks to the teenager standing in front of him. The audience, once eager to laugh at Maya, now sat in stunned silence. Langford shifted in his seat, his confidence shaken. Maya simply stood tall, waiting. Calloway set down the documents and slowly looked up. His voice, once laced with condescension, now carried something different, something like uncertainty. Miss Carter, he said, his voice quieter than before. Where exactly did you learn all of this? Maya paused, scanning the courtroom before returning her gaze to the judge. I read. Your Honor. The gallery gasped. Judge Calloway studied her carefully, as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Something wasn't right. This wasn't normal. No teenager should know how to deconstruct a case this well. So who was Maya Carter? And more importantly, what else was she hiding? Judge Robert Calloway leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, his fingers interlocked as he studied Maya Carter with a look of growing curiosity. The condescending smirk he had worn earlier was long gone, replaced by something far more serious. Miss Carter, he said, his voice quieter now, edged with caution. Where did you learn all of this? Maya stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable. She let the question linger, the tension in the courtroom thickening as everyone waited for her response. Then, finally, she spoke. I read. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Langford let out a sharp, sarcastic laugh, shaking his head. Oh, come on. She's reciting legal terms like she just memorized the textbook. She's trying to sound smart, that's all. But Calloway didn't look convinced. He didn't take his eyes off Maya, watching her with a measured intensity. No, he muttered under his breath. It's more than that. Langford scoffed, turning toward the judge. Your Honor, this is absurd. This girl is trying to play lawyer in front of an actual court. Maya tilted her head slightly. I'm not playing anything, Mr. Langford. The prosecutor rolled his eyes. Oh, really? Then what are you? Maya exhaled, took a step forward, and dropped the bombshell. I'm not just a defendant, she said, her voice sharp and steady. I'm an attorney. The room erupted. Gasps filled the courtroom, followed by frantic whispers and murmurs of disbelief. The gallery buzzed with shocked voices, some people leaning forward, others turning to their neighbors with stunned expressions. Langford froze, his face twisting in disbelief. Excuse me? Maya's eyes didn't waver. You heard me, she said plainly. I'm a licensed attorney. Langford laughed again, this time louder, shaking his head. That's ridiculous, she's a teenager. She's lying. He turned back toward the judge, throwing up his hands. Your Honor, this is nonsense. But Calloway wasn't laughing. He didn't even look amused anymore. Instead, his gaze remained locked on Maya, a flicker of doubt crossing his normally stoic features. Miss Carter, he said, his voice low, serious. You're telling me you are a fully licensed attorney? Yes, Your Honor, she said. I graduated early, passed the California bar exam last year, and was admitted as a practicing lawyer. Langford's face darkened, his frustration evident. She's making this up. Maya's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. You can check. Judge Calloway turned sharply toward the clerk. Verify it. Now. The room went silent. The clerk's fingers flew over the keyboard, the only sound in the chamber the frantic clicking of her typing. Langford folded his arms, shaking his head. This is a joke, he muttered. But then, the clerk froze. Her eyes widened slightly, her posture stiffening as she stared at the screen. Everyone leaned in. Well? Calloway prompted, his voice tense. The clerk swallowed hard, then turned toward the judge, her voice barely above a whisper. It's true, she said. Murmurs surged through the courtroom again, growing louder by the second. The clerk glanced down at her monitor again, as if double-checking. Maya Carter is a registered attorney with the State Bar of California. The courtroom exploded. A mix of shock, outrage, and sheer disbelief flooded the room. Some people shouted, others whispered furiously. A few just sat there, wide-eyed, struggling to process what they had just heard. Langford's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. No, this isn't possible. This has to be a mistake. Maya simply stood there, her expression unreadable. Calloway rubbed his temple, looking genuinely stunned for the first time since the trial had begun. You're telling me, he exhaled, you are a fully licensed attorney at 17 years old? Yes, Your Honor. Langford's face turned a deep shade of red. This is highly irregular. She's allowed, Calloway interrupted, his tone suddenly much quieter. He looked down at the papers in front of him, flipping through them as if searching for a loophole, something to prove this wasn't real. But it was real. Maya Carter wasn't just some kid standing trial. She was a force of nature, and she had just turned this entire case upside down. David Langford's face turned an alarming shade of red. He slammed his palm onto the prosecution's table, his composure shattered. This is ridiculous, he barked, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. She's a child, a minor. She shouldn't even be allowed to stand here, let alone argue a case. Judge Robert Calloway remained still, his expression unreadable. Slowly he exhaled, then adjusted his glasses. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. She's an attorney, Mr. Langford, he stated, his words carrying undeniable weight. And she just dismantled your case, piece by piece. Langford floundered, his hands balling into fists. She's manipulating the system, he spat. This court is being turned into a circus. Calloway raised a hand, silencing him. What's absurd, Mr. Langford? is that a 17-year-old just outmaneuvered a seasoned prosecutor in my courtroom. His gaze darkened. And that's not her fault. That's yours. Langford opened his mouth, but no words came out. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. The once mocking courtroom was now watching Maya with something else. Respect. Maya remained poised, her hands resting lightly on the defense table. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't act triumphant. Instead, she spoke calmly, deliberately. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady. "The justice system isn't about assumptions. It's about truth." The room hung onto her every word. For the past hour, we've heard the prosecution argue a case built on circumstantial evidence, an inadmissible confession, and an unverified surveillance tape. They assumed my guilt. They assumed I wouldn't fight back. They assumed they could win on perception alone. She paused, letting her words sink in. But assumptions don't belong in a court of law. Calloway leaned back, nodding slightly. Even he had to admit she was right. Maya turned toward the gallery now, her voice unwavering. "The law exists to protect people, not just convict them. It's meant to uphold fairness, not validate biases. And yet, we see it time and time again. People who look like me," she gestured toward herself, "people who are young, underestimated, dismissed before they even speak, being forced to prove their worth before they're even given a chance." The room was completely silent. Langford had stopped fidgeting. He was staring at her now, a realization dawning in his eyes. Maya took a breath and delivered her final words. "If the law is to mean anything, it must mean justice. And in this case, the only just ruling is to dismiss these charges." She stepped back, and the courtroom held its breath. Judge Calloway rubbed his temple, his fingers tapping against the bench as he gathered his thoughts. Then, finally, he let out a long sigh and looked up. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice measured, "I must admit, I misjudged you." Maya didn't react. She simply waited. Calloway cleared his throat. "I assumed you were just a kid out of her depth. I was wrong." He turned toward Langford now. "And I assumed this case was built on solid ground." His gaze hardened. "I was wrong about that too." Langford lowered his head. He already knew what was coming. Calloway lifted his gavel. "Given the lack of credible evidence, the procedural errors, and the violations of due process brought to light today, I have no choice but to dismiss this case." The gavel struck the bench. "Miss Carter, you are free to go." The courtroom erupted. Some people clapped, others whispered furiously to one another, and a few stormed out, clearly dissatisfied. But there were others, the quiet ones, who simply nodded, as if silently acknowledging what had just happened. Maya didn't gloat. She simply stood there, letting the moment wash over her. Judge Calloway watched her for a long moment. "You've proven yourself today," he admitted. "More than I ever expected." Maya finally spoke. "This isn't about me, Your Honor." She exhaled, shaking her head. "It's about doing better. All of us." Calloway gave a small nod. "Well said." Maya gathered her papers, straightened her posture, and turned to leave. And as she walked through the heavy double doors, into the bright sunlight outside, the world finally saw her for what she truly was. Not just a teenager, not just a defendant, but a fighter. And they would never underestimate her again. Maya Carter pushed open the heavy double doors, stepping into the bright sunlight. The crisp air hit her skin, but before she could take another step, a swarm of reporters rushed toward her, microphones extended, cameras flashing. "Miss Carter, how did you pull this off?" one called out, her voice breathless. "Did you know you'd win?" another asked. Maya paused, standing tall. She took a slow breath, then turned toward the nearest camera, her eyes steady, her voice clear. "The law serves everyone," she said, "not just those who fit the mold." The reporters leaned in, eager for more, but Maya had nothing else to say. She had already proven her point where it mattered most. With her head held high, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the city, leaving behind a courtroom and a justice system forever changed.